Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Sigma 23mm F1.4 DC, meaning it's for APS-C cameras, and then it's DN, designed for mirrorless cameras. I've reviewed this lens previously in Sony E-mount, but at that point I had some anticipation for checking it out in an X-mount, which is now finally here. The reason why I was intrigued by that is that this was a very high-performing lens on Sony E-mount. And having already started to discover that not every lens is up to the task of looking good on Fuji's 40 megapixel APS-C sensor, which is currently the highest resolution available on APS-C, I was curious to see how the Sigma would hold up here, because it seemed like a lens that was up to the task. And I'm happy to report that that is in fact the case. We'll dive into it a little bit further. Now, what's interesting is that not long ago I did my review of the Fujifilm 23mm F1.4, the LMWR, or the new version of the lens. It's a really high performing lens. And what I have found is that the Sigma provides similar levels of optical performance while undercutting that lens by about $350 US. Now, that's not to say that the Fuji doesn't have some advantages. It does. But are they enough to justify that extra money? That's what we're going to explore today, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
The 23mm is a very interesting focal length to me personally on APS-C because it has basically the 35mm full frame equivalent angle of view. That's a really useful angle of view that is usable for a lot of things. Some people are 35mm people, some people are 50mm people in terms of the way that their brain works. But if you're a 35mm kind of brain person, it could be one of the most important lenses in your kit. And so that makes this a really important kind of foundational lens for a lot of people. The price point is $549 US, making it a reasonably priced lens compared particularly to the Fuji, which is $899. So you're basically talking about $550 versus $900 US. That's a $350 difference. Now, there are some cheaper lenses down at the $300 price point. There's a Viltrox and a Tokina 23mm f1.4. However, neither one of those lenses are anywhere near as high performing as what either the Fuji or the Sigma lenses are. As you can see, the lens is not tiny, but at the same time, it is quite compact. It is 65.8 millimeters in diameter, or 2.6 inches. That gives you a pretty small 52mm front filter thread. And the overall length of the lens is right under 80 millimeters, or 3.1 inches. It weighs in at 333 grams, or 11.6 ounces. So that makes it about 50 grams heavier than either the Tokina or the Viltrox, but 40 grams lighter than what the Fuji lens is. So again, it kind of, like the price, it strikes a point kind of in between the two extremes. It looks actually quite similar in size to the Fuji lens. If you have them side by side, they're more similar than different in their overall profile and look of them. The lens itself it is pretty bare bones in terms of the feature set. Sigma kind of established a standard for this particular series of lenses, and thus far they haven't deviated from it. Even though on the art series side of things, they have continued to add new features and add complexity to the design. They haven't done that on this particular series, which falls under their contemporary branding. And so what we have got is a weather sealing gasket at the lens mount, but no internal weather seals. So that is one area of differentiation from the Fuji, which has a thorough weather sealing throughout. And here on Fuji in particular, you notice the absence of an aperture ring, which is pretty much standard on Fuji X mount. Almost all lenses have an aperture ring, and so that lack is going to stand out here. There's nothing like an AF-MF switch or ability to declick the aperture, any of those more advanced features. All that you've got on the lens barrel itself is just the focus ring. Now the focus ring is nicely damped. It does work well, and so no complaints about that. It does come with a really nice lens hood that I would say is nicer in my opinion than the one that you're going to get on the Fuji. It's a little better materials. There's more differentiation in terms of the textures and the just overall function of the lens hood. That's all a little bit better, but there isn't a whole lot of features that are going on here. Now the argument could be made, well yes, the Sigma has fewer features, however, it is considerably cheaper than what the Fuji lens is. The problem, of course, with that is that while the Viltrox and the Tokina 23mm don't have weather sealing, they do have the aperture ring and, of course, the new Viltrox 27mm F1.4 lens has both thorough weather sealing and the aperture ring. And it comes in at the same price point as what the Sigma does. So at this point, I would say that it's hard to argue that this is just a price differentiator. This is more something that I think Sigma needs to adapt to changing conditions on the ground and add a few more features. Now what's here is nice. It's a nicely made lens. It functions just fine. It's just not particularly feature rich. There are 9 rounded aperture blades inside, and so it makes for a nice circular aperture even as you start to stop the lens down. Minimum focus distance is 25 centimeters, and that gives you a 0.136 times, so right under 0.14 times magnification level. That is bested by the Fuji, which has a 0.20 times magnification, so considerably higher. And it's even bested by the new Viltrox 27mm, which finally breaks the Viltrox 0.10 times curse and moves up to 0.15 times. So that is actually better than what we see here on the Sigma as well. And so again, decent build here, but not a whole lot going on in terms of features. Autofocus here comes via a stepping motor, STM motor, and as has been kind of the standard all across any of these third-party lenses that I've reviewed on Sony E-mount as well as Fuji, autofocus performance is better on Sony than what it is on Fuji. I think that there are 2 factors at play there. One of those is the simple fact that Sony autofocus is a little bit better in general. So you're getting better, more consistent autofocus in camera, and that's particularly noticeable when it comes to the video side of things. The other factor here is, of course, that the move into the Fuji X-mount space is it's a new move within the last year for these third-party lenses. And so as a byproduct, I think that they're still maybe figuring out a few of the ins and outs of Fuji's autofocus as opposed to these other platforms. Now, for stills, however, the autofocus actually worked quite well in most metrics. I found that IAF worked very well. I had very good eye detect on people and consistent autofocus on their faces and eyes. Also in taking pictures of Nala, for example, I got, she kind of, rolled around posing for me. I got very good focus in this series on her eye. I found that my general stills performance, that focus was accurate, and even when shooting at f1.4 and narrow subjects, I got consistently focused results. Focus speed was definitely adequate in most situations, even good enough for a distant bird in flight, but not quite quick enough for reactionary shots like Nala on the move. I wasn't as successful in nailing those. I did notice one kind of quirky, what I would call a calibration type issue. That is, at some smaller apertures shooting landscape distance shots, I actually found that on a few of those shots, I got what I would call a focus beyond infinity, to the place where everything is just slightly out of focus, and it's not a front focus, it's a back focus issue, which tells me that the lens infinity calibration is not quite perfect. Now, in all fairness, I am reviewing a pre-release version of the lens, so it is possible that this is something that would be fixed in the retail production, or it's something that could be fixed via firmware. I have brought it to Sigma's attention, and they are investigating it at this point. But for the most part, in 99% of situations, I got very, very good autofocus for photography for stills. On the video front is where I have noticed these third-party issues more, and that remains true here. And whereas I had pretty good pulls performance for video work on the Sony side, as you can see here, the video pulls are a little bit rough on Fuji. There's also, as there was on Sony, but it's even more apparent here, there's some really obvious focus breathing that kind of highlights some of those focus difficulties. Likewise, when I went to do my hand test, the transitions in at least one of the 3 cycles went to the background behind me rather than moving to my hand. That's a little bit of an odd quirk for me because the hand was the kind of obvious thing there. And so rather than focusing on the obvious, it moved to the more obscure. But again, I think that these are probably all things that can be ironed out somewhat via firmware. On the positive front for video, I did note that if I was locked onto a subject, say in the wildflowers in the shot, as they moved around, even at f1.4, I was able to stay locked on them without any kind of problem. There wasn't any focus pulsing or loss of focus. And so that all was a very much a positive. I also will say that the video footage looked very good. I shot some in 8K on my XH2 and the footage looks brilliant. Very highly detailed, colors are nice, and so it is certainly a very nice lens for video capture, outside of some of the autofocus quirks there at this point. Now on the image quality front, I commented during that Sony review that I was very interested in trying it out on Fuji. As I've noted, not every lens is holding up all that well at the 40 megapixel resolution point, which is very high. And so I felt like this is a lens that probably could thrive in this platform. And as we're going to see in our image quality breakdown, I believe that that is the case. Let's dive in, let's take a look.
All right, the first thing that we'll take a look at here is the vignette and distortion. Now, as far as the distortion goes, it is similar to what I saw on Sony in that there is some barrel distortion, but it is quite linear, easy to manually correct, which I've done on the right. But it has also been the trend with the lenses that I first reviewed on Sony and then subsequently reviewed on Fuji X mount. I have found that there is significantly more vignette. That's also the case here. Whereas I needed to correct about 2 stops of vignette on the Sony E-mount, it's closer to 3 stops here, and it's a +10 that I've dialed in for correction. Now, fortunately, not necessarily a huge deal in that correction profiles will take care of things. However, that kind of heavy vignette in certain low-light situations, you may see some additional noise in the corner where the dark shadows have been corrected. Now, in most situations, longitudinal chromatic aberrations were not a big deal. In this kind of extreme torture test, you can definitely see there is some fringing both before and after the plane of focus. This is sun hitting like raindrops on the top of something. So it's definitely a torture test, no question about it, but you can definitely see some fringing there. In a less extreme situation here, lower contrast, you can see here that even though we've got a white subject that is against a darker background, there really isn't a whole lot of issue there to behold. And so in most situations, I really don't think you're going to have an issue. You may see a bit of fringing in really extreme situations. Now, number one, I think the image looks great here, but we're going to take a look at lateral chromatic aberrations that show up near the edge of the frame. And fortunately, you can see that they are quite well controlled. No significant issue here, no real fringing showing up here in these bare branches towards the edges of the frame. And so overall, this is a nice neutral performance, no problem there. Now, back when I reviewed this lens on Sony and saw it perform so highly, I thought this is a lens that will hold up well on the 40 megapixel sensor on Fuji's X mount platform on some bodies, like my XH2. And it is the most demanding platform that I test lenses on right now. That's the equivalent of a little over 90 megapixels on a full frame sensor. And as I expected, this lens performs really well even on this very demanding platform. And so here in the center of the frame, it's essentially a flawless performance. Mid-frame looks really great. And as we move down, you can see that contrast remains really excellent, and even right down into the corners, right off until that very edge. You can see a kind of a transition from here to here as we're losing contrast as we get towards the corners, but for the most part, it holds up really well. In fact, for some perspective, Fuji's own 23mm F1.4 is a fantastically sharp lens, and one of the best that I've reviewed on the platform in terms of just resolution. You can see here, however, that the Sigma is pretty much holding its own by comparison and at a whole lot less money. Mid-frame looks about the same. I would argue throughout here that there's even a little bit more contrast on the Sigma. Likewise here, I would argue the same. Moving off to the edge of the frame, you could probably say that there's a tiny bit more for Fuji here. Just as you can look down in this area, you can see it's not losing as much contrast. But overall, these lenses are quite close. Now, the other competitor here, of course, is the very new Viltrox 27mm F1.2. And yes, it isn't the exact same focal length. However, it is pretty much the exact same price. And we can see that at F1.2, the Viltrox is basically every bit as sharp in the center of the frame. And if we move towards the mid frame, they both look really, really excellent. Lighting's not quite the same, but they both look really, really strong. I would say in this section, the Sigma is just a little bit sharper. And if we move off into the corners, the Viltrox is holding up contrast better, but I would say as far as the resolution that the Sigma is maybe a hair better in the corner, though obviously it is very, very close there. Looking over in this zone, however, I would say that pretty clearly the Sigma is looking better. Likewise up here, the same is true. We move up towards the top here, I would say that the Viltrox is looking sharper up here. So, you know, basically, as it is so often with these lenses, it really kind of boils down to where you're looking. They're both very, very high performing. So for a little bit of real-world perspective here, here at just 100% magnification rather than 200% magnification, we can see that, you know, already there is good detail that was there. Contrast is obviously better as you stop it down to f4 here. The resolution was actually looking quite good, and we can see that it stays pretty consistent. Yes, it's a little bit better, as you can see comparing this truck and this truck. That contrast is certainly helping, but overall the performance is really quite similar between the two. And so even at f1.4, this is a lens that you certainly can get images that you'd be happy with. Likewise here, another wide aperture shot here at f1.6. You can see that in the plane of focus, detail is nice and crisp here in the center of the frame. Now obviously depth of field is not going to allow everything to be in focus when you have some depth to the scene. But you can see that it holds up just fine for landscape type work. And then if you're a little bit closer here, like we can see on the subject, I mean, that's really, it's all the detail you could ask for at f1.4. Looks really, really fantastic. Now in lower light situations and a little bit higher ISO, obviously we're not going to see things quite as crisp, but you can see that even in the setting we've got proper focus on the eyes, and thus detail looks really, really nice. So if we stop down a little bit from f1.4 to f1.8, we can see that yes, there is a pretty noticeable bump of contrast in the center of the frame. If we pan up here towards this zone, you can see that it's just a little bit more consistent in terms of contrast. And even going down into the edge of the frame, you can just see that there is some improvement here, though we're still not completely dark here towards the edge of the frame. Better still at f2, and you can see that we're starting to get, you know, a deeper blacks here towards the corner of the frame, and also that the detail is starting to crisp up there. Now from f2 to f2.8, you see that transformation completed to where we have good sharpness and contrast all the way down into the corner of the frame. So a great looking performance there. Now from f2.8 to f4, we can see just a little bit more performance that we're going to find in the center of the frame. We are pretty much peaking here. And in fact, if we go on from f4 now to f5.6, diffraction is just starting to set in. And so this is about as good as it's going to get looking across the frame before things start to drop off. And so we've reached kind of our critical point. And by f8, you'll see that diffraction is starting to set in on a high-resolution body like this, and so things just aren't quite as crisp. Now that will carry on through the minimum aperture, which is f16, but you can see by this point, diffraction has really softened up the contrast. And so I would basically, if you're shooting on the 26 megapixel sensor, you could probably shoot up to f11. On the 40 megapixel sensor point, I would recommend going no higher than f8 if at all possible, because you will have diminishing returns after that. Now, as noted previously, our maximum magnification is very usable here. And you can see that also up-close performance remains quite good. Plane of focus is fairly flat, and there's good contrast and detail. Now, obviously, that will allow you in certain situations to get your background fairly defocused despite the wider aperture here. But as we're going to see, where I feel like the weakness of the lens is that the bokeh is only so-so, and that's very similar to the Fuji performance. Like, I mean, that looks fantastic, great detail. But as you look towards the background is only okay. This image I think looks quite good, but if I compare it to the Viltrox, for example, which does have softer bokeh, the Viltrox definitely looks better overall. In this issue, or this image here, you can see that there's a fair bit of outlining in the bokeh, and that just kind of draws your eye to it more than what I would like. So it's not necessarily ever like super soft and creamy like the best even 35mm lenses on full frame are. So that is kind of the limiting principle here. I did find the colors looked good from the lens. It's a nice landscape lens for sure. Skin tones were nice. And here, I think, you can see some of that outlining that I've referred to, some of the cat eye shape near the edges of the frame. In this case, we've got a little bit of sun in the frame, but I think the lens is handling the flare really, really nice. And so you can see that contrast is held up. There's just a little bit of an artistic look up there. Likewise here, just a little bit more of that, but, details holding up on the subject, a tiny bit of fringing in that high contrast situation. And I would say my only negative here is really this in here, and that there's just too much of that outlining, very similar to the Fuji 23mm. Here's another shot here that's less about the bokeh and more about the fact that at a wide angle or wide aperture, even with the sun right there in the frame, contrast is flawless. Likewise, here shooting right into the sun, you can see that continues to be flawless even if you stop down a bit more. There's a little bit more of those artifacts. And here you can get a better look at the sunburst effect, which I really think is quite nice with each one of the blades coming off of the sun looking nicely defined. Here's another shot here, which shows you that it's a nice looking effect if you trap it between some solid object where you can squeeze out that sun star. It looks really quite nice.
So in conclusion, I would say that the Sigma 23mm F1.4 DN on X mount provides the most valid alternative to the Fuji 23mm F1.4 at that 23mm focal length. If that is the focal length that you're looking for, this lens is very close optically, though I will say that the build and the autofocus slightly favor the Fuji. But if you feel like the things that I've detailed, you can live with those, you can definitely save a pretty big chunk of money. The Sigma comes in at about 61% of the cost of the price of the Fuji. So that's some pretty significant savings. Now, it's not exactly 23mm obviously, but the new Viltrox 27mm f1.2 is my personal favorite near this focal length. I just like the blend of the build, the performance, and then the optics, particularly with having that extra wide maximum aperture of f1.2. The trade-off there is it is considerably larger and heavier than what this Sigma lens is. It's larger in every dimension. It's about 200 grams heavier. And so that is significant. And if your idea of using a Fujifilm platform is the ability to travel light, the Viltrox is not going to be your flavor. And in that case, you might want to consider this Sigma 23mm f1.4. It's a very high performing lens, and it is up to even the 40 megapixel standard here on Fuji if you're shooting with one of those cameras. And that makes it a very intriguing and welcome alternative to the Fuji X mount platform. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also linkage there to my image gallery if you want to check out photos. There are buying links there. Some of them for X mount are obviously just being populated, so be patient and they will be there. Beyond that, there are linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron or get channel merchandise. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.